I'm Steve McLaughlin, Dean of the Georgia Tech College of Engineering, and this is The Uncommon Engineer.
Fine. 1-800. We live in an age.
Sounds incredibly complex. It sounds like students, you need to have abilities that span. I'm really geeking out here.
Maybe we could put tiny microphones around the knee and listen to the sounds emitted from the joint while a person moves the leg to get an idea of if there's structural abnormalities or injuries, or maybe wear and tear that could lead to higher risk of injury for that athlete.
I'm kind of imagining, like you said, that patch or the armband, and the sensor is detecting blood flow through veins or arteries. And so what's the sensor? Is the sensor a sound? Is it what's it sensing?
We would be sensing three different modalities. So one would be electrophysiology, so electrocardiogram measurements. The second one would be mechanical measurements, so vibrations of the chest wall in response to the heartbeat. We measure that with accelerometers, really low noise accelerometers that are normally made for seismic activity detection. And then the third modality is optical measurements, something called a photoplethysmogram, but essentially you just put light into the body and look at the reflected light back, and it gives you a quantification of blood volume pulse. The second one of those, the seismocardiogram.
So like a pulse oximeter, isn't that how a pulse oximeter works?
Exactly.
You shine a light and that determines the oxygen content of the blood. So it's the same kind of thing.
Exactly. So
I think a lot of folks have that when they have their vital signs, is that pulse oximeter, and it can be used for other things.
Absolutely.
As well.
That's one of those. So there's a signal that's measured from which they just take basically two amplitude values and use a lookup table to determine pulse oxygenation, so pulse oximetry. But there's a signal behind that. There's a waveform that, of course, many people have studied, but that really has a lot more information about pulse pressure, arterial tone, basically stiffness of the arteries locally, that can be, I think, mined and sort of exploited for these sorts of purposes to get more information about the physiology. Especially our group has been really interested in pairing that signal with these central measurements of cardiac forces and vibrations. And that's a signal, so that's called the seismocardiogram, because it's the seismic movements of the chest wall in response to the heartbeat. That one really has not been studied much in literature. There's been people, it was first discovered 20, 30 years ago for astronauts in space, and sort of has been an interesting signal for people, but it's not really well understood.
So you have these three signals. You have the electrocardiogram, which I think most people are familiar. It's an electrical signal. Like you said, you have this chest wall, this thing that's determining the thumping of your chest, and then you have this pulse oximeter or this light. And so I'm kind of and then you talked about machine learning. So you take these three signals and you kind of crunch them together, and you've learned, or through other patient data over time, that what these three readings are give an indication of, hey, how much blood is in the system, or how much blood has been lost. And so that's real. And it must be that those three signals, or even other signals, can tell you other things about the body. It's not just blood volume, but it's telling you have these three really different ways of sensing what's happening in the body. You combine them together and you learn other stuff, but you learn that other stuff from past experience, either with that patient or other patients. Am I kind of getting that right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So
I haven't lost it.
No, that's exactly right.
So then again, I'm kind of, what's the aha moment around why those three signals? And there must have been a moment in which you thought, those three things together can tell you how much blood volume is in the body. Where does that inspiration come from, or what's the aha moment?
It's again through collaboration. So there's one of the world-leading cardiovascular physiology experts happens to be a consulting professor here in the School of Biological Sciences. And he and I have been having discussions for the last 3 or 4 years on how one might be able to sense blood volume status actually in a different application for heat stress. So for a soldier, for example, or an athlete performing exercise in a hot environment or in an environment where they have protective clothing so they can't dissipate heat properly. And so from those discussions, we started looking back at the really old literature, which I remember I had this great professor at Stanford that told us the best inventions come from looking at patents from 100 years ago and what people thought were cool ideas but really couldn't do because of the technological limitations then. So some of the first studies on heat stress physiology were done using this signal called the ballistocardiogram, which 95% of cardiologists have never heard of, and probably 99% of engineers have never heard of or thought about it. But it happens to be the signal that I studied extensively for my PhD. And that was also an accident, but that's another story. Most things are an accident. Like most ideas just are total accidental. So because I had known about that signal, it allowed me to appreciate how in the 50s and 40s they had used that signal to assess the effects of heat stress, hypovolemia, or really blood volume deficit. And that, I think, is what started getting me thinking about the fact that, well, now we can use these really low noise MEMS, microelectromechanical systems, accelerometers, to measure similar sorts of things just from the chest in a wearable form factor. You wouldn't need these giant tables or beds that they used in the 40s. And so that might be something that could be translated to a point of care sort of setting. And also, I think the other part of it is that I had learned a lot of cardiovascular physiology in my PhD. I had taken courses in the med school, which here also I have a lot of my students do that. I think that's an important opportunity, and it really, it helps you to understand really the other side of things, right? The medical side of things. So because of that, I think we had sort of thought about this and thought that this might be a good idea, and it may actually work.
Any one of us who's been a patient at any time really understands the value of experience. There's nothing that replaces a doctor who hasn't done this particular procedure, 1,000 or 2,000 times, and we seek those out. But now the tools exist so that experience can be captured through machine learning. And, maybe that's the transition that you're talking about is that doctors become more comfortable in this idea that it's actually the machine that's learning and that can capture the experience in a fast and more complex way to complement their own experience. Because I think there's so much nuance around treatment that's based in its core in experience. And as doctors become more comfortable of offloading, trusting the experience of the machine, capturing that. So that's a really, that's a place where we can really be part of a solution.
Yes, definitely. So decision aids, things that can help them make their decisions hopefully better, maybe quicker, or maybe where they're not even able to see the patient if someone's in a remote setting. We are, I think, as Georgia as a state, unfortunately, I think we're 48th in the country in terms of accessibility of healthcare in rural communities. We have a lot of underserved communities right here in our state where the doctor is not even there to be able to make decisions that are important for treating patients or to just screen for hypertension or do basic sorts of activities like that. I think that our engineering tools can really make a huge impact there. And we have a forum actually coming up in April that I'm part of organizing through this Georgia CTSA, where we're working with Morehouse, with some community-based organizations, and with the communities in Atlanta that are underserved to try to think about what could be some blue sky, exciting opportunities for mobile health and other sorts of technologies to maybe help bridge that gap between what we think might be really accessible and effective healthcare and versus what they find to be really unacceptable and sometimes non-existent healthcare.
Love is just like baseball. Love is just like baseball.
Say more about the stimulus, how you provide that to, you said the vagal nerve?
Yeah, so the vagus is essentially one of the cranial nerves, and it sends both information from the brain to the body and also from organs like the heart back to the brain. And so, and it's in the neck. So it's something that's somewhat accessible non-invasively at least. And what we use is actually an FDA-approved device. So the stimulator itself is commercially available and approved for migraine headache. But VNS overall in the scientific literature has been used a lot lately for various different things, for modulating inflammatory response, for modulating cardiovascular response, and also for this sort of central nervous system effective kind of therapy or modulation.
I'm curious about, so certainly you hear lots about PTSD and how debilitating it is for soldiers and others who've experienced trauma. I'm curious about, maybe you said it, but I didn't hear it, about there's the detection that there's a PTSD event kind of coming on. There's the anticipation of that. There's then the stimuli that assuages or in some way tries to minimize or allows the person to better manage. And then there's what you do after, like what you learned from it. Is it that whole system?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And the first part is actually the hardest part, detecting that such an event might be occurring, such a reminder is occurring in normal daily living. And that's the part that we're just getting to now through longitudinal measurements at home in some of these patients.
And so that goes back to the three stimuli, right? You can kind of imagine as someone's having a PTSD event, I'm not sure I'm using the right words, but are recalling what occurred to them. You can imagine the body is reacting in at least three different ways, for which you could extract, and a machine learning algorithm from lots of past experience can help you predict, but needs to do that very quickly to then to excite the stimuli to assuage the event. So that's super, super exciting, and especially since the three methods you talked about are all non-invasive. And the idea that you have these microphones on the outside and presumably just some kind of a bandage or some kind of something that holds them in place, and then be able to really extract precise diagnostics from that is powerful. No surgery required, no MRIs required. Low cost sounds like everything, and so. In terms of for that kind of a device or so, I mean, can you get the fidelity that you would need compared to other ways of imaging inside? It just seems like there's huge potential from a cost standpoint, and if you can get similar or even better information, that's huge.
No, that's a great point. So imaging is so wonderful in terms of the information we can get from it. It's always going to be higher resolution, higher fidelity, higher quality than really anything we can get from non-invasive sensors. The big difference is that you can only do realistically imaging, let's say, one time to diagnose the injury. Maybe if you're a professional athlete and if you're Roger Federer and you have your meniscus tear from taking care of your kids in the bathtub at the Australian Open, then maybe you can have multiple MRIs. And maybe even then you don't really. So it's not used as a longitudinal tool. You get it to know that the person has, let's say, an MCL tear or a meniscus tear. Afterwards, when they're trying to rehab the injury, when they're going through all of these stages where physical therapists and the people that they're working with, their trainers, are deciding, okay, now you're ready to do plyometrics. Now you're ready to do more complex movements. Let's try to do maybe some jumping on that knee. Let's move to some things that are more dynamic rather than just static strengthening. All of those decisions are based on pain and symptoms and based on kind of the feel and the thought process of the PT or the trainer. That's where I think we have some huge room to make improvements, because the sounds could be measured every day. They could be measured almost, continuously, maybe during normal activities of daily living. At the very least, the person could do some exercises maybe once a day, a couple times a day, or even their normal physical therapy exercise, and we could measure them. So we'd get longitudinal information that can then be used to make those really, really important decisions that you can't really use imaging for. So it was only really when I got to the later years of my studies there, and particularly 2004, when I took this course in classics, taught by this really interesting professor who was fascinated with the ancient Olympic Games. And he wanted us, and by the way, this is really also a class where I fell in love with my wife, and we were married about a year afterwards, so we started really dating during that class. So that also made it special. But he was fascinated with how the depiction of the way that people perform their sports was so inaccurate historically, and how there's no way that these really myths about Discopolis and these other sort of Greek figures that were performing athletic tasks could possibly be true. So we did things like we would build discus mock-ups that looked like the ones from paintings on these ancient sort of Greek ceramic pots and those sorts of things. And we would try to throw them and see, could you throw this thing as far as some of the stories said that people could? And of course, it would sort of wobble. It's not aerodynamic at all. It would kind of fall 5 feet in front of you when you feel like you could throw it much further. There was a javelin that we made. That seemed to be closer to reality. I think they were, because it's more of a weapon. You can't really hurt someone with a discus, but javelin is kind of like a spear. So at that time, I started actually thinking about, as an undergrad, this was my 5th year, because at Stanford you can blend the BS and MS program, kind of like we can here at Georgia Tech as well. So I was an undergrad at the same time as I was already a master's student. And I started thinking about maybe even starting a class on the physics and engineering of sports. And there were some classes there more taught from an information theory standpoint. So there's a really famous professor there, Tom Cover, who, of course, was teaching more of the statistics of sports. But this would have been more along the lines of why are discus or other sorts of throwing implements shaped the way they are? How do we create sort of rotational inertia and sort of speed up through the throwing cycle and other sorts of basic sort of track and field events? And that's when I started getting interested in the crossover, I guess. Finally, when it was less of a burden, I guess, on my academic career and more of something that I thought was a really interesting synergy. As a grad student, the project that I was working on was essentially a weighing scale to try to measure the mechanical aspects of heart function. And the place where it overlapped with sports medicine was actually where we started talking to some cardiologists who had an interest in this phenomenon called hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, which is essentially an enlarged heart muscle, enlarged not for physiologic reasons, so not because the body is working harder in lifting weights or doing other sorts of sports-related exercises, which also enlarges the heart, but in a way that's productive and helps it to sort of function better for that higher performance task. But instead, a heart that's enlarged because the cardiac muscle cells are kind of in disarray and not organized as they should be, and so the contraction of the heart is ineffective. And it can be really dangerous. And in fact, it's one of the things that leads to sudden cardiac death in athletes. And there have been some, of course, really famous athletes that have died sort of suddenly on the soccer field, basketball court because of that. So some of these cardiologists there at Stanford were thinking about trying to screen for hypertrophic cardiomyopathy and using non-invasive methods that could be really quick and could be used even, say, in the physicals, annual physicals that the athletes do at the beginning of the year. So we had included some of our hardware in those screenings, got some initial interesting results that we weren't really sure how to use. But that started, I guess, planting the seed for me that maybe some of this engineering sensing stuff we work on could be used in the context of either helping athletes be healthier or maybe helping them prevent injuries.
But it's the doctor's job to keep people healthy, as well as to cure them once they're ill. Learning about the different kinds of medicine, about performing operations, caring for children who get sick, how to tell one disease from another, how diseases affect the body, and how medicines act on diseases, and many others.
What we attempt to do is to explore through tests that we have devised, determine whether a patient can respond best to, and in this process, decide where and how we should undertake the recovery process.